To order, since we do not have a committee chair yet, and that's the first agenda item we'll need to do, but this is our first meeting of the year for the Financial Oversight Committee, and you guys do need to select a chair. I would say that with your organizational meeting at the second meeting in November, you have a chance to kind of reset what happens with P&G operations and financial oversight. So you aren't committing to it long term is the read between the lines version there. So if somebody wants to nominate a chair.
So I'd nominate Jane as chair.
I'll second it.
We got a nomination and a second for Director Finch for chair for Financial Oversight Committee. Does she accept the nomination? You should probably ask that first.
One-off, right? Just one night.
That's all you have to commit to. All right. Any other nominations? All right. This is the part I didn't think through. Now I guess we
You
have
could
to
just
do
do
a
it all in
voice vote.
favor.
Yeah.
Yep.
All in favor?
Aye.
I saw all ayes. So, all right. Jane, you're the chair.
Your license.
So you can turn it over to me right away if you want to. Yeah.
Just kick back. I'm going to kick it back to Matt.
Excellent speech.
Your acceptance.
All right. So thank you for doing that, and thank you, Director Finch, for being willing to chair the committee. One thing we had talked about with the SBRC last year was a financial oversight committee, and we really handled a lot of our meetings through the operations committee last year as we did significant budget reductions. But I do think that's a regular piece that I've talked to you about individually that we just need to work into our rotation. That's a healthy thing for organization to have in place. And so we do anticipate meeting frequently. I don't have a cadence established probably to share with you yet, knowing how we've organized P&G and operations, but that would be something I'd like to talk to you about hopefully at the second November meeting about what is the regular occurrence or time slot for this meeting. Two things for this evening. I just have a few slides I want to walk through with you that I think give the high level overview of what we're here to talk about with the SBRC, and then some of the finance reports that'll be on the later agenda for this evening. And so we'll spend more time on those finance reports in the meeting, and Adam will do more of an overview there. But really what I wanted to start with here was just this broad overview. So with that, I'm going to stand up, go to the computer, and jump into that. But I would say if you have questions, just feel free to jump in as we go along too. At some point, I'll ask Adam to walk you through a little bit of the forecasting tool we're using to show why we're making some of the assumptions we're making.
I would say the documents you put that Kim sent us when they got up on the agenda, they were really, I thought, easy to read and to understand. I thought they were really well done. So I don't know, the team that drafted those, I thought it was excellent. Yeah.
Well, thanks to Adam and his team. He did the heavy lift on that. So.
Well, it was excellent.
Yeah. So kind of just to open our budget planning conversation here, and you notice I put on there responsible planning in a changing financial landscape. I think the overall message is, our budget planning isn't something we can look at as a one and done, right? Or that we can do a cut and then we're going to be around a budget situation. I think just looking at kind of current financial landscape and what's coming at us, and we've had these conversations about state revenues and knowing that how tenuous that is and how some of the state funding has been tenuous for over a decade. This is something we just needed to get in the habit of doing and somewhat make comfortable, right? That as we're continuing to evaluate and evaluate our budget and our priorities. So as we know, last year we worked really hard to cut $8 million from the budget, and it's put us in a much better position to handle some of the things that we have in front of us. And so what you'll notice in board docs tonight is a lot of focus on my clicker's not working, on the SBRC exhibits, and then on our different financial reports that I talked about at the opening of the meeting. What I want to focus on here for a minute is why those things are there, right? And kind of some of the reasoning behind current financial or recent financial disruptions, our response to those, what are some time-sensitive and long-term budget adjustments that we need to consider, and then how we continue to look at those and make our district a destination district and the district of choice here in Iowa. Excuse me, I'm going to keep clicking that. You're just going to have to be patient with me, I guess, because I'm going to keep messing that up. So One of the things Adam uncovered when he started his work in certifying our car that's submitted on September 15th to the state of Iowa is some miscalculations and misallocations of funds that really caused some problems for us when trying to certify a balance to the state or unspent authorized balance. And when we looked at that, there were several of those coding issues that we ran into that in the end resulted in us having a negative unspent balance for fiscal year 23. So if you remember, fiscal year 23 is the year we just would have closed in June. We're operating in fiscal year 24, and we'll be planning for fiscal year 25. And a few of those examples were substitute teacher costs, substitute para costs, and a couple examples there would be when we hire teachers, there's categorical funds we can pay for those subs out of, and we weren't taking advantage of that. We were just absorbing all of those costs out of the general fund, which wasn't our preferred method. Our preferred method or our approach that we had wanted to execute was that those should be categorized out of categorical funds. Para costs, another one. Most of our paras are special education paras, and so if we'd had a sub for paras, that charge should have been happening back to the special education budget, and that was not happening. I mentioned a couple other funds on here. Teacher quality budget, misallocated and underutilized. There's some funds we have available to us for TQ that we could have accessed that would have put us in a better financial position at that time, and did not. And the same for ESSER with underutilizing some funds. We came into the year with $1 million of ESSER funds, which we'll spend, of course, but knowing that we certified a negative unspent balance last year, those funds could have been accessed at that time. And so as we're thinking about this and communicating this, I think it's also important to note, and I'll come back to this when I show you the 3 fiscal years, is that no funds went missing. There was no stealing, no theft, anything like that. In fact, our audits have been clean throughout this process, right? And so we've had plenty of cash, and we've paid our expenses. All of that has been fine. The problem is this concept of spending authority. And so spending authority is really what we're given permission to spend from the state. And so the negative is really reflective of going beyond that permission. It's not that we went into the hole with the amount of money we have. So I think that's an important concept for people that don't operate in school finance to understand and probably reiterate as we work through this process. Another example of some things that we've worked to clean up in the interim here, since we've noticed some, would be failure to project expenditures accurately. So when we look at how that spending authority is determined and we start to measure our bottom line, a big factor in that, of course, is our expenses and how much are we expending. And we were not accurately forecasting those out, and so then of course it was hard to make budget assumptions and decisions when we had bad data entered into the system. July and August salaries were not accounted for, so that's an example of a major miss in those expenses. When you have 2 months worth of salaries that we don't have factored into our expenses, it's pretty hard to to accurately project what your expenses are going to be. Again, you see ESSER here. We had some ESSER funds in that budget comparison document that we kind of looked at different times this year that were counted in multiple places or that we committed in multiple ways, and so again, not an accurate projection there. We weren't accounting for 100% of our positions to be filled. You would think when we plan a budget cycle, we would want to make sure that we're assuming we're going to fill all of those jobs and what our max expenses would be. And then another forecasting issue for us was inflation increased expenses. We know things have cost more and that prices are up, and so that we needed to account for some increased expenses. We just can't use last year's number as we prepare for that. So without belaboring that point, I just did want to show a few examples there, but then also talk a little bit about the impact of ed savings accounts. We know that ed savings accounts were something new passed in the legislature early last January, and they have had a significant impact to us. They've impacted our planning for fiscal year 25 in the way of the equivalent of 110 full-time students. And so when we had projected to be up 75 students in all of those assumptions you guys looked at last year, our forecast this year actually shows us down 60 students. Now, Adam and I have talked about this one. I think it's also important for our community to know, in comparison to other UEN districts, other large districts, we're actually very well situated with the number of students we've lost. Their impact has been much more significant. I was almost embarrassed at our UEN superintendent meeting to say our number, right? Because it was so small in comparison to some of the other large districts. But it is gonna be an impact point for us as we go forward. The other thing we've talked about is what's happened with our open enrollment. And so we're actually net gain. We're at a net gain position for our open enrollment at this time. So we are that destination district. People are still choosing our district. And we should feel good about that. When I started at central office, I remember we were down 200 to 300 students via open enrollment. This year we were positive. So that is something we should be proud of, that we should continue to talk about, but also not ignore the impact that vouchers will have and how that'll affect our assumptions. I don't think we have a great way yet to know the projected impact other than to make some assumptions about our enrollment and trying to put in a factor for, instead of assuming increased enrollment like we were here for a period of time. We probably need to be real conservative or factor in some small decrease in enrollment for a period of time. So kind of time sensitive versus long-term budget issues. When we look at the budget reductions we are going to need to look at, the thing I would say here is we really tried to be aggressive, and that work was rewarded for when we look at our budget this year. We did make a significant impact. That's something you'll see in the SBRC docs. I think that'll be a good part of the conversation with the school budget review committee, that they know we have really aggressively tried to address our budget situation. And so that is something we'll highlight to them. But we still do have some time-sensitive issues that I'm going to walk you through here. So while it's put us on good footing, the work is just not finished yet at this point, and we're going to try to look at these as some gradual decreasing of the budget over a number of years rather than just another looking at it through the lens of a one-time cut. That's kind of where I started tonight, right? This is just going to be an ongoing process for us. So time sensitive, this kind of lines it out for you as I talked about those different fiscal years. So the year we closed is negative 474 for a negative unspent balance. And I think an important point to explain to people when we talk about this one is, remember, our budget is almost $220 million for that fiscal year. So 474 is not a large miss or a large area to go negative, right? And so that amount of money, again, is not money where we were in the hole or we were in the red. It was the money that we were beyond our authority. So we feel like we can correct that measure and do that. We also feel like we can do that for fiscal year 24. As Adam's dug in and accurately portrayed our expenditures, now we feel like we have about a $3 million difference we need to make up in that spending authority number to get ourselves back in a solid budget position. So we'll talk about a $3 million budget adjustment here midstream this fiscal year. The good news is a lot of the strategies we think we can employ shouldn't be overly disruptive or complex to the system. When we look at fiscal year 25, that's the one where it's going to take some more input and some more engagement, right? Because it's a little bit bigger number there. You can tell a $5.5 million budget adjustment as we prepare next year's plan and next year's budget. We'll need to do some engagement similar to how we did the process last spring and again, listen to people, take ideas, present some options, and then land on what we want to do to make that adjustment. Though I would say that to our folks, we want to know, we would want them to know that this assumes, we're already assuming a number in here for a salary increase in wages, right? That we know that's an important point that we want our people to know. We're not just trying to factor in a 0% growth on expenditures, right? That we do know while that's a negotiated process, we have some work to do there. And that we want our people to know this isn't going to be done entirely on the backs of negotiations or anything like that. We know we have to look at a lot of strategies, but that's not going to be our primary mechanism for attacking this problem. And then finally, fiscal year 26, as we projected out, is a smaller adjustment there of about $2 million. So you can tell that cycle of just continuing to review, continuing to try to shave some expenditures to right size us. And at this point, I want to kind of transition to Adam to show you that forecasting tool, just to get an idea about why we think that's the right culmination of the amount of dollars to put us in a position of where we want to be. I'm assuming you're going to plug in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
document here. So this is also linked from the agenda for the board meeting a couple times. And really just wanted to walk through some details as it relates to the situation that we're in. And apologies, I'm zoomed in a lot, so hopefully you can at least read these numbers. But the column that I'm focused on is this final column that's in maybe yellow or green. I'm colorblind, so I don't know, thank you. This final column that's in yellow. And I'm mostly focused down here at the bottom of this table. So if I go over here a little bit, you can see this very bottom row is unspent authorized budget, and that's that negative $474,032 that we ended up at for the last fiscal year. And as I move over a little bit, you'll see, and this is based on some of what Matt will share here in a minute, and we had to plug in some numbers to present to the SBRC coming up at our hearing next month. So these numbers will change as you all have discussions and as we engage with the broader community. But ultimately, just wanted to give an overview of where we're at. So right now, we're looking at an expenditure reduction that's really tied to, as articulated, that reduction in spending authority. So if I zoom in here a little bit more, the bottom row is our unspent budget, and then the row right above that is our expenditures for each fiscal year, and then the row above that, where it's $208,812 in that final yellow cell, that is our budget authority for that year. You'll notice moving from FY23, which is the final one in yellow, to FY24, the current year, which is the first one that's in this white shaded background color. You'll see that that authority amount drops from $208 million to $196 million. Despite the fact that we did have a 3% increase in supplemental state aid, this FY24 is based on a small enrollment increase of 44.1 students. The big reason that that authority amount drops so much is ESSER funds coming off the books. So when we spend federal grant money, including ESSER, for every dollar we spend, it generates a dollar of additional authority. And so last year we spent $19 million in ESSER funds. This year we started the year with about $900,000 left to spend. And so that's effectively an $18 million authority difference that's attributable entirely to ESSER coming off the books. And so that, combined with growth in some other areas, including regular program allocations, yields this authority number of just over $196 million. And so looking at our expenditures last year of $209 million, that's why going into the year we made the $8 million in cuts, which is critical that we made to make this doable. And then also in that decline in costs are some non-recurring expenditures primarily funded through ESSER. So for example, COVID stipends were part of that expense number the previous year. We weren't planning on those. They weren't included in our cut number either, but those come off as well. So we began the year with this number down to about $198 million. And a little actually over that, but that's where we got to that roughly $3 million that we needed to identify to pull out of our expenditures midstream this year to get under that $196 million in authority. The reductions of about $5.5 million for the next year, again, you'll see our expenditures are projected to decline from FY24 to next year, FY25. But not by that $5.5 million number. Expenditures decline by just under $1 million. And the difference in those numbers, again, due to the fact that we are projecting cost increases in certain areas as well. And so it's unrealistic to think we just hold everything at zero and cut. And so we're trying to project reasonable increases along with those reductions, so that as our authority grows to a projected $199 million, we're holding that expense line down right around $195 million, helping to build that unspent budget in that bottom row to $4.5 million for FY25, and then increasing to a healthier amount that's closer to that 5 to 10% range here in years past that. So that's really kind of the quick overview of what's really driving that decline in authority and what drives our need to address expenditure reduction. Yeah.
So that
196 number, does that include the budget guarantee in it?
So we do not hit the budget guarantee because with a number of other factors, including our increase in net open enrollment, the positive growth in that area, along with the fact that the 3% is also calculated along with our loss of 61 students from a certified perspective, we don't hit the budget guarantee for this year or for next.
And the $1,200 per ESA student that we lost?
Also factored into this. So that's factored in not for FY24, but for FY25, which is when those begin. Yep.
So about what is the amount for FY '25?
So the total number, and that's going to fluctuate, the D's told us we won't have a final number till December or January. As of today, it is 469 students on ESAs. So the math works out to roughly just a little under $600,000 that we would get as part of this authority and part of our allocation from the state due to that $1,200.
We're projecting 469 students, is that correct?
That's how many have actually been reported by the private schools as it relates to ICCSD residents attending their schools right now. And then going forward, we project that number to grow. This forecast, and again, we're trying to work with whatever information we can get there. This forecast has that number growing to 600 students for next year and 700 students the year after that, based upon the assumption that many of the students who had signed up for this program have already signed up in year one. I think that's probably a pretty conservative estimate of growth there. It's difficult to calculate though, and I wanted to keep that on the conservative side in terms of what our allocation would be from ESAs, in part because we also stand to lose additional funding if we have students who leave the district to take advantage of ESAs in year 2 or 3 as the income qualifications disappear.
In the 469 student number, is that that's an additional 469 students over?
Nope. So just to clarify, so Matt had shared
Compare
that
that to the 110.
Yeah, Matt had shared that we lost 110 FTEs. That was based on an analysis we actually did of the students who were reported in that 469, and we looked at which ones had attended our district last year, and then we compared that. We actually lost 132 FTEs of those students. But we also looked at previous year data and determined we normally would have lost about 20 kids who would have left the district to go to private schools. So that's where we came up with that 110 FTE impact. The number of students who are enrolled in ESAs who are district residents is 469, but most of those students were students who were probably already attending private schools and were definitely not attending our district.
Okay, so if the newspaper says the ICCSD lost 469 students because of the state's ESA thing,
That would be incorrect.
That would be incorrect.
Yes.
It's been really hard to follow, so it's helped me a bit to look at the states that have already started using the ESAs, and of course every state legislature tweaked it a bit, and ours is still tweaking it, right? But that number of 469, the percentages you see in states that already have them, it is fair or reasonable to anticipate that the number won't blow up.
Right.
Because most ESAs are used by people that already go to private schools. Having said that, I appreciate the language you're using, the cautious language, because again, every state has been different. I mean, the trends are all similar, right? That ESAs are trash and that they only hurt everybody. But it takes time for everyone to learn that lesson. And so we'll have to see how Iowans learn that lesson, right? How many give it a try and then realize, oh man, public education was so much better. So I'm glad you're giving us some caution about it, and I also think as a board and as the public, we need to accept that there's some guesswork here.
Yeah.
So 2 things I want you to touch on before you sit down with this chart is the variables that are still in here, right? The ones that could adjust, and then also, I'll actually take the second one. Just talk about the variables.
Yep. So there are a number of variables that go into this forecast for future years primarily. Those include supplemental state aid, so what rate the state is going to set. We have assumed for this forecast a rate of 2.5%, which is what we were recommended by a number of individuals we talked to in state organizations. Obviously, we will remain sensitive to any word about what that is likely to be for this or for coming years, knowing that it's not likely to be the same rate for all of the years in this so that's one thing that we're certainly sensitive to. Enrollment is another one. Enrollment directly drives our budget authority. And so what we are assuming is a year-to-year decline each of the years of this forecast of 0.2%. And that works out to basically 30 students or so. So we're assuming relatively steady, but generally declining enrollment. That follows this year when we declined 61 students, again tied to ESAs, but as you said, we don't really know what the impact of ESAs will be on an ongoing basis. So we've factored in that negative 0.2%. That could be higher, that could be lower. So that's another area that we're looking at. Another variable that's not maybe as often discussed, but is important, is miscellaneous income. These are things like federal grants that we receive, other grants that we receive, and when we receive that type of income, it actually impacts our authority in a positive way. Sometimes the impact on the unspent authorized budget is negligible because you receive $1 million to implement this new program that costs $1 million, and so it's a wash in terms of your unspent authority. There are cases, though, where we can receive income, we can receive grants that might offset costs that we were already incurring. So that's another one that right now I have built in very slight growth in miscellaneous income after we lost more than 50% of our miscellaneous income coming into this year. And that's something that tracks with our historical rates, but again, that number can vary quite a bit, so it's something else that we'll want to keep a close eye on.
The other one that Adam's talked a lot about, and I think that we'll want to talk to this committee about, is how we monitor this number, the expenditure number throughout the year, right? And so what are some checks we can put in place? How do we do some real-time measures of that to make sure that as we think we're controlling expenditures, we actually are, right? So what do those payroll amounts look like month to month? What are the other expenses we're incurring? And then giving the committee or the board just a real-time look at those expenses, because that can change, right? I mean, if we commit additional funds in the middle of the year, you believe we're going to change that number midstream, right? And so that's some of the work we're going to talk to you about here next, about how we reduce that number midstream. So that was another one I wanted to mention on the variables. And then the last thing that I want you guys to have in your head before we come back to P&G at the end of the month is, what is the right number down here? And so if you go back and look, this was the negative number. If you go back and look at the district's history of this is a little bit why we have a problem in the current situation too, because we're not adequately prepared for anything of this nature, or for an across-the-board cut, or a 0% from the state. The last year, we actually were probably in a fairly healthy position, was fiscal year 18, where we had a $9 million unspent balance. These other years, look how thin we're running: 3.8, 2.8, 3.1, 200,000, and then negative, right? And so when we then go ahead and scroll over here again. So then when you look, where the board has some good influence in this is telling me where you want that number to be. What's the range you want that number in? Do you want it all the way as high as 11 to 12? There's some best practice information we're going to give you that probably shows that number for our district as high as $20 million. We're a ways away from that, right? And so that might not be reasonable. And I think we also have some things to consider about being a big district and knowing that we know our philosophy has been getting resources as close to kids as possible. And so what's too thin, what's too big, where do we want to be as a district, right? And that's where the board should set some policy. So next time at P&G, I'll put a policy in front of you guys that really kind of brings back in that recommendation for the superintendent on where that unspent balance should look like. The other concept, if you want to read up ahead of time, if you're not familiar with it, that we'll talk to you about is solvency. And what is that? What's the right measure for that as well? And so a little different concept than we're talking about here tonight, but also an important one.
Can I have one piece of that history?
Yep.
The history that Patrick showed, Molly will remember it well, because when we started to see that decline, that's when we did the original $6 million cut back in the spring of 2019. And so we started that work, and then when we got the ESSER dollars, we started making some decisions. And so it's kind of, as Matt said, it's something we knew was coming. So we were on track for that, but then when we got ESSER, so it's been kind of like a 3 or 4 year pause to what had happened. It wasn't like that just stopped. It was that influx of those dollars.
So that kind of gives you the outlook for how we landed on 3, 5.5, and 2, right? That's the position it gets us in. Again, based on some of the conversation we have, or as variables get solved, again, those aren't set in stone, right? But we have to have a goal and we have to have a marker of where we would like to try to go. So when we kind of consider these, break down each of these fiscal years, you look at 23, that's the documents with the SBRC reflecting, okay, why did you have a negative 474? And then the next year, what are you going to do about it, right? What are we doing about it right now? So we can pause here a little bit if you have questions about the documents. I don't know if a lot of, like I said, I'm hitting some of the high-level information in those documents. And there's a little bit more here in the slide deck too that gets into some of those details, but did want to give you a chance in case I talked too long and run out of time. If you had anything you wanted to pause on the SBRC documents about maybe just taking that first part about why the 474, that was the opening of the presentation, so that would make sense right here.
What expectations are there for us at the general meeting when this is on the agenda? Is there anything we might want to, I don't know, focus on right now while we have this space? Or, you know, what does it look like at our general meeting tonight?
I think at the general meeting, really what we're asking you is to approve those exhibits, that's the plan we're putting forward to the SBRC, and so that requires the board president's signature, and so we need that action item by the board so that the board has been obviously made aware of the situation, what we're presenting to the school budget review committee. But if there's anything in there that you're questioning about why it's there or what we're suggesting. One thing I would say, just to skip ahead, when we look at fiscal year 25 and 26, you notice this slide is blank, right? Because I said we have to do some engagement. Now that conflicts a little bit with what's in your document because we still had to have a plan to submit to the SBRC, right? We can't walk in with this and say this is our plan.
Right.
So there's going to be some things that we get from public input, from staff input, from administrative input, from board input that could change, you know, what's reflected in our plan. But we had to give them a realistic plan of what we would do to reduce expenditures over that period of time. And I think some of those suggestions are going to be ones that, again, is the engagement process I talked about before. So twofold, why did the 474 happen where you went beyond your spending authority? What are you going to do to fix it this year? And then long term, right? That's what you see kind of articulated in those SBRC documents throughout. Charlie?
So, Matt, can we say whether or not the proposed budget adjustments or spending adjustments and that we're going to present to the SBRC, or as you've recommended that we present to them, are they going to have a significant impact on our ability to accomplish the goals in our strategic plan and in our diversity, equity, and inclusionary planning?
So I'm going to wrap up a little bit with that with
Okay.
that line of talk, Charlie, at the end of the presentation. But the bottom line is those are still our goals, and we still have a responsibility to achieve those goals. I think whether we're talking strategic plan, ICCSD 2030, the initiatives we talked about, our comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, those are all still our goals, right? What we're trying to do is establish the base level financial security to achieve those. So we're not walking away from those or saying we're not doing those things or we're backing away from our commitments in any way. This is a matter of us optimizing our resources to accomplish those. And so I think that's a consistent message. That's a great question for the board because that's where we'll also start to get some concern or question, right? Well, does this mean you're not doing this? Or does this mean you can't do this? And that's not going to be my advice to you. That's not going to be the recommendation. I don't think anybody around the table is suggesting that, but that's an easy go-to for people, right? And so I think that's a great question. So we'll kind of end on that point.
Thank you.
As you
Yeah.
monitor the expenditures throughout this year, how often can we expect to hear reports on that?
That's a good question, and we haven't really discussed it.
I mean, we're going to track them monthly, right? And I just don't know if it makes sense if you want to see them at every meeting or if you want to see them whenever we do a financial oversight committee meeting. I think that probably the position you're in, it wouldn't be a bad idea to couple them monthly and some kind of a standing agenda item just so you can kind of track what we're tracking because we'll have them and we'll be reviewing. So I think it would be a good measure just to have for you
I
guys.
think that would be nice because
Yeah.
we are cutting it a little close.
Yes.
Right.
And it'd be
Yeah.
very simple to put on
Yeah.
just a simple, revenues to date, expenditures to date, and that would be probably the cleanest way, especially with prior year comparison, to see exactly where we're tracking compared to what we would expect and compared to where we expect to end up.
Related to that, we had every one of the general meetings, there are all the attachments that we go through, and we all promised that we'll go through all of those items. And I've done it since I've been on the board, but I've never been, there's no onboarding for that. So I don't exactly know what I'm looking for. Basically, I read all of them, and if one seems weird to me, then yeah, I ask Kim. I think moving forward, as we're putting in these additional checks and balances and making sure, if you want to lean on the board, I think as a board, we need to be more responsible for explaining what we're doing, right? Because we did decide we would take turns focusing on who was in charge of really being careful at reading it through every meeting. I think we got to double down on those promises and figure out if we're using our time wisely. So
That's what I was going to say too, Monica. That's a great point that, and we've talked about that. I think a more respectful and responsible use of your time would be looking at those expenditures, right? Than
that's what I
reading
wonder, right?
combing through the bills, right? I mean, like, there's probably good questions that are generated, probably learn stuff through that process, but at the same time, from a global perspective and looking at district financial health, that's a better use and practice for the board to get to, for sure.
Yeah, because otherwise it's kind of hard. We don't know exactly what we're comparing it to, right? Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I had to ask
Well, what's
Jane,
weird-
just to be sure, 81 pages, I said, so I'm looking for what, this
Uh-huh,
last
and
one.
We were
And I
really
thought I was on track.
And I gave you the advice that Jay gave to me.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
very good, all right.
Which, yeah, no, there is, I mean,
Weird numbers and,
yeah, weird numbers and what the heck is this for? Not super scientific.
When I think that
Well, that's
practice
what I
developed
think
out of
big
the concern
numbers.
of an individual board member,
That's right.
and probably was not the best global look, right? And so there's better we could do, and I think we'll have some of those practices
Yeah.
instituted.
Yeah, I
So I think it was.
I personally think that as a board member, my looking at itemized bills is a waste of time. I have no idea whether or not the expenditure is, makes sense or not.
Yeah, I remember one of my first questions was about why are the electric and water bills so different? Like, well, why is it $7,000 for this month? And it's just, where things fall. But again, yeah, is this a good use of time?
Yeah.
So, lessons learned.
So we've talked a lot about 23, and I would just say the only thing I haven't mentioned here is the first step in this process is we'll ask for forgiveness for the 474 that we went beyond authority. They may or may not grant that, right? Other districts, when we look back at the minutes, it looks like they've forgiven that. They may tell us no. If they forgive that, then our $3 million goal quickly becomes a $2.5 million goal is the other thing. So some of that could still change. To get to the $3 million, this might be a little small for you to read here, but I think the theme from this slide, really when we look at it, is we do have some additional funding flexibility that came to us from the legislature last spring. So this is a tool we'll utilize right away. Some of the balances I was talking about in the beginning where we didn't utilize some funds will actually work to our advantage here now. So TQ budget balance of $1 million. The recoding issue I talked to you about subs, I mean, quickly there you're at 1.7, right? That we'll be able to ask for some board action on moving some categorical fund balances to the general fund to right size the general fund for our expenditures. So the recoding sub just means we get that to that special ed account like we had talked about. Other categoricals, TLC balance, 200. I kind of quickly went on a piece of data today. We still want to refine this 350. We think we got some additional Title I funding flexibility today of another 150, so that's changed from 200 to 350. But again, you look at those, we're quickly climbing, right? Another big one that we're going to consider and that we've started moving on right away is district employee reassignments. So where we've had open building-based positions, we'll be moving district-based staff into those building-based positions and then not rehiring the district role. So we'll serve the buildings, the ones that directly work with kids right away, and move some of our district folks out to those positions for the current period of time. These other ones, without going through to me, some of it's transitioning positions so that they can match responsibilities of the categorical role. Like we may have had some positions serving our buildings that if they were really functioning as special education behavior interventionists and receive that training, then we could pay for them out of special ed. So it might be rethinking some current roles we have that way. Subs is another area we've spent a lot of money just in general, and so trying to rethink some of our approaches to substitutes will be an important part. And then the last one I really kind of want to leave you with that we'll be communicating out information here as early as next week is early retirement. We will go back to an aggressive early retirement incentive. Yes, with the insurance, we told the principals this afternoon, and we'll actually offer a January early retirement incentive too. And so if people would like to consider retiring in January, we'll give them that option with the caveat that if we get, well, the example Chaser used earlier, 3 administrators at central office, we might tell them you gotta wait until the end of the year, right? So there could be some specialized positions where we'd say, I know you requested, but I don't think we can make that work. But where we can, then we'll look for those mid-year incentives as well. But this is really, again, a strategy for us without knowing we don't want to rift people at the end of the day if we don't have to, and consider those measures. We like to try to treat our people who have been with us well and give them a nice incentive to retire if that's on their radar. So you will see communication information about early retirement coming.
There's one thing I see when I look at that list that, and I've received a lot of phone calls this week actually, there's been some people talking about the SBRC review and things like that. So one thing I hope that we're keeping an eye on, and I imagine we are, is when we are moving people around, because we need to be, we need to be doing this, we're going to be constantly checking to see how to be at our best operationally. I think I'm just hoping that we're looking at buildings specifically and the dynamics and numbers in every building. Because I think that we've learned, especially as we're going to have to become more efficient, that not all of our buildings are the same. And I don't mean the facilities. I mean the demographics in each, the size of each. We're moving to middle schools. The size of each middle school will be drastically different. I just hope that we don't think to ourselves, oh, this school, all the schools should have 2 assistant blah and 1 blah and 1, I mean, the equation has to be different for each school depending on its needs. And maybe that changes every year, every couple of years, I don't know. That's a lot of where the education and operations side kind of comes together. But it's something that I look at that and I think, oh man, I sure hope we're thinking about the middle school changes especially and what each building needs, because each building's needs are very different.
I think that's a great point. We've actually had a couple principals even offer that up because they know that too, right? And they see that and they understand that their building is probably not needing to be staffed or positioned the same way as another one.
Good.
I think it becomes almost a larger conversation for us in terms of strategy here, right? As we think about our elementary and secondary campuses, then what is the right mix? And how do we factor in some of that, we've kind of developed in language that concept is RAM, right? So how do we RAM our buildings and how does that impact then what we can do from trying to optimize efficiency? So I think you're right, it's probably not uniform across the board in every position category, but I think that's a strategy we want to look at here to try to do that too. Not that it couldn't come into the conversation about some of the reassignment and whether or not it's needed to fill that at this time. But I think the first thing we want to assure people is we're not talking about moving from one building to another. We're talking about district-based staff that would go fill a building-based role for folks.
So, kind of to follow up a little bit on what Marcus introducing here, without continuing to respect your authority and your role as superintendent, are we going to, can I anticipate that building staff, district staff will feel confident that they can convey their interpretation of what budgetary changes to make and get that to us as a board for our evaluation? Probably, I would, in my view, that evaluation would be in light of your recommendations as well as superintendent.
Right, Charlie. I think if I understand what you're saying, I think what we can guarantee you is that, yes, there will be opportunities for input given to those folks. What I can't guarantee you is that our team will agree with all of their input, right? And so they'll provide input, they'll give some advice on strategies, things like that. That may not be something we bring forward to you in the end, right? And you may have alignment with us on that, or you may hear something else and you may ask me a question, Matt, why do you guys consider this? I heard this from a building-based person, right? So our job that we can guarantee and that we need to do is to make sure we listen and that we receive their input, and then we need to try to make our best recommendations to you guys based off of those opportunities. And I think that goes beyond just the principals, right? I mean, we did engagement with Brady last year through this process and the Teachers Association. What's their input on this? And so those are all those multiple inputs we need to factor in before we make a recommendation. So we're not totally out of time, but we're running thin here to 15 minutes before the hour. I kind of already explained this to you a couple times, what I think the next step is there. And then this was Director Easton's question here a few minutes ago, long-term budget considerations, and then what are our priorities as we move forward. And so we're all committed to the strategic plan goals. Charlie had mentioned the Comprehensive Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Plan, ICCSD 2030. When we look at Center for Innovation, middle schools, preschool, those are all important things that we've committed to as a district that we have goals around and commitments to. And so it's not that those take a back seat, it's that how are they part of this new conversation and this new landscape. I do think as we continue to do this work of evaluation and reevaluation, we do have to look at these and figure out how do our assumptions maybe we've had here long term also play into these new priorities about the attendance centers we have, the staff costs that we incur, class sizes, breadth and depth of curriculum. Those are all going to be realities for you. I think what we want to try to do that I've asked the team to start to pull together is what are some comparison points for us here, right? How do we look at what other UEN districts have and how do they operate, and to try to just give us a baseline, because we only know what we know. We only know what it looks like here or our own experience maybe in another district, but how do we get a landscape kind of portrayal of where does Iowa City sit in comparison on some of these, knowing that we have commitments to want to do new things in the future. We know we need to optimize resources to the greatest extent possible. So where are we underspending, where are we overspending? I think that's, again, some of the continual work that just makes this an ongoing process. And then the last one, right, our goal with that in mind is that we just keep elevating the district, right? We are a destination district. Everybody that's here is super proud of our district and the experience we offer to our kids. I mean, I think that's reflected in even that data point we talked about, ESAs, when you do a comparison for Johnson County to other counties in Iowa and what that experience has been. People want to be here, right? We recruit and attract and keep expert educators. But that all starts with having the baseline of financial security, right? And so that's our first assurance we have to make, and then we think about these. And I just mentioned expert educators, our academic achievement goals that we continue to have. We know also in 2030 we talk about great learner supports and knowing that we serve the full continuum of students. That's what makes us us. We're all in for all kids, and so we're going to provide that to everybody. We've got the top-notch facilities. We've had a great plan, 2 plans as we work through those. And then finally, how do we continue to look for those opportunities to innovate? And I think we've addressed a lot of those concerns or questions here tonight. But if you have other ones now, of course, we can take a couple of those here before we get towards the end of the meeting. I didn't just stand up and walk you through each of the SBRC documents, right? I figured you guys did a nice job of looking at those before, and I think it's really reflected in the slides from a high-level view about what landed us to the conversation and then the work that we need to do moving forward.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, in a lot of circumstances, I would have needed that walking through each one. Again, the documents were really well done. I just read it and thought, wow, this is like a brief.
I understand this.
Right, it was just, so normally I'd be like, I think we gotta go through everything, and I thought it was just really solid.
The other variable I think we still are not 100% sure on, as much as we tried to ask some questions, is there anything the SBRC tells us, right, that we'll also need to either put in our process or that they'll just say, this is something you need to do, right? Since we did have that negative year, is there something they direct us to do that maybe changes, the nature of the conversation, or something we have to look at that we didn't have there before? So, of course, that means December 12th, we'll be able to report back relatively soon after that. I don't know if turning around right away that evening, because that's a board meeting night, is going to make the most sense. But we should have some good information there quickly after.
Because the next meeting will be in January, correct? After that.
Yeah, because we only have the one in December, that's right.
All right, and our next financial oversight committee meeting is?
To be determined. My guess is January is what I would propose, because we'll do the December SBRC meeting, and I think it would make sense to probably try to couple that early January right after break, and we report back there and give you a status of maybe some of the things we're executing. I think with some of the expense monitoring, I want to get to you guys before. I think that's something we could build into an earlier meeting, but from a full committee meeting, my suggestion would be January.
And to add on that, we've also kind of talked about doing a middle school construction update for the December ops meeting, which would be what would happen.
Yep, that's what we did.
It's good work, Matt.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
just appreciate, it's frustrating to be in this position, but I appreciate that, one, we were headed this way anyway with this financial oversight committee, which shows good foresight. So I just think we're well positioned. And then with middle schools, I just think there's a ton of opportunity for some operational efficiency there. And it's just, it's frustrating to be here, but I'm really happy you guys are the folks kind of taking us through this, because obviously we have a good plan, and we'll turn it into a great opportunity to get better.
Thanks.
Okay, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.